Hello there, and welcome back, or welcome back for me. 2 weeks ago I promised to talk to you about the refugee and migration crisis that's gripping Europe at the moment. It's often been described as the greatest crisis in modern times of its sort. And even in the 2 weeks that I've been away, the temperature and the political climate in the Netherlands has polarised around this issue. So I want to spend the entire time of this broadcast talking about the crisis and to discuss whether it is indeed the greatest ever. It is certainly more visible because they've actually started arriving. The poor and the hungry have left the TV screens and have started appearing at our borders and in our streets. But is it really the biggest refugee crisis? Well, to be honest, we didn't really care. 2.7 million parked in Jordan, 2 million in the West Bank and Gaza, 1.5 million in Turkey, 1.5 million in Pakistan, 1 million in Iran didn't bother us as long as they stayed there. So it's not because they're refugees, it's because they're coming here that we see it as a crisis. And then, of course, there are all of those that didn't get the chance to be refugees at all. They died. They would have loved to have been refugees. 5.5 million in the Congo, 150,000 civilian deaths in Iraq, 40,000 in Afghanistan, almost 200,000 in Syria. They cannot be refugees. I'm sure they would love to have the problem and the option. But is it unprecedented? Well, I want to stop first with a rather boring bit on definitions. What is a refugee? Refugee is someone who has left their country and has obtained asylum in another country. They have crossed a border, and the border is important, otherwise you're not a refugee. They have crossed the border and had their claim recognised. An asylum seeker is someone who has crossed the border looking for safety, but has not actually either claimed it or had it recognised at the time. And then you have irregular migrant workers or illegal migrant workers, people who are working in a country and are not documented. And then you have legal migrant workers, those who are working in a country and are documented. And all of these are people on the move for various reasons, various advantages. Now, we have to explain a couple of points. First of all, there's no class definition of an asylum seeker. You can't say everyone from a particular country deserves asylum. Under international law, every individual case has to be looked at individually. Is that individual likely to suffer harm, imprisonment, death for reasons that are beyond their control? And equally, there's no class definition of what is a safe country. You can't say everybody coming from there, they will not have it. Again, you have to look at each claim on individual basis. Now, if you look at this question of safety, you have come to the conclusion that most asylum seekers that are arriving at your borders are already safe. Many of them are in fact asylum shoppers. They are leaving camps of safety in other countries and arriving in Europe. And when they arrive in Europe, the Europeans say, okay, we see their problem, we can see their plight, and we want, and this is a discussion at the moment, we want to spread the burden. We want to spread the migrants over Europe in different European countries. And then within each European countries, the authorities want to spread the migrants as well. But that's unlikely to work. These are literally seekers for a better opportunity. They are not going to stay in the country they're allocated. They're not going to stay in the rural towns they're allocated. They're going to go to the cities where there's more work and more opportunity. One of my colleagues, often on the news, uses macroeconomic statistics to say, look, the asylum problem is not really a problem for the Netherlands. A country like the Netherlands can take this number and more. And that's true in a macro level. But they don't go in the country as a whole. They settle down, and it's at neighbourhoods, not at nation level, that asylum seekers become a problem because of the strain they place on the local infrastructures and on the social relations that are already established in the places where they arrive. We can't use macroeconomic data in order to wipe away a problem. Now, is it really the biggest ever? Well, we have nice categories: asylum seekers, refugees, illegal migrants. They didn't exist in the 19th century. So I suggest we skip the labels for a while. Take away, they're people on the move, and they're on the move across national borders. So it's easier perhaps to look at why people move, and there's always been a sort of classical explanation of this. There are what are called push factors, factors such as fear, want, deprivation or loss that force people to decide they have to leave their country, there's no hope for them there to go abroad. And against that there are pull factors, the opportunities of betterment, advancement or gain from moving to another country. And then there's a third factor that's called chain migration. It is when one group's already established, sending back information and often means of migration back to their home countries, and then a chain sets up, and that goes on long after the initial push has already occurred by family reconstitution and the like. So all of these factors play a role today, and they've played the same role in the past. So is this really the greatest crisis? And I think probably not. If we look at the size of the world population now and look at it about 100 odd years ago, 110, 120 years ago, and compare the migration moves then with those that are taking place now, I think basically we could conclude that the period 1870 to 1914 especially were probably greater in per capita terms than they are today. There were various visible parts of that move, the large numbers of Europeans that left Europe and went to North and South America. Large parts from the Indian subcontinent went to Africa or to plantations in the colonies to work. The Chinese diaspora moves through Southeast Asia, all in this period. But you also have invisible movements. The people within Europe, often within these large national empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that are leaving, fleeing the persecution that they're experiencing, or even civil wars that are raging in the Balkans and other areas of Europe. And of course, there are the Native Americans in North America who are being forced to resettle and resettle as the great white tide and European tide moves across the American continent. So in terms of movement, probably that movement was greater than it is today. But, and just to conclude, the movement's somewhat different today, I think. Most of the movement from population in those periods were from settled countries, often fairly densely populated countries, to less densely populated countries. South America had room for people to find jobs, find opportunities, pick out a life as a farmer or a farm labourer, etc. Now we're getting migration from poorer parts of the world to highly densely populated countries with sophisticated infrastructures, and it's a different type of situation. And the other thing I think we have to bear in mind is there's now a much greater difference in what an ordinary person gets in a country like Europe or the United States and what an ordinary worker gets in their own country. The gap now is much greater than it was when you were a poor person in the Balkans and you become a poor person in the factories and the sweat houses in New York. Most working people did not have a fantastic life 150 years ago. And that has changed rather radically. And that has altered their perception of the benefits of moving and our perception of what we have to do in order to incorporate them in our societies. As long as those factors exist, pull or push factors, they're not going to go away. They're likely to persist. People now have the means and the information to move, and they're going to continue to move as long as inequalities, lack of hope and desperation exist. And I think it's the time for the Europeans and the Americans to start thinking of a better way of coping with it than the solution that they have now. So those are the words I wanted to say today, and thank you very much for listening.